Hello, and welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles. Those are the lectures associated with the 695th Lord Mayor of London. In this series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, what the current Lord Mayor, Michael Magnelli, calls the world's coffee house, in an analogy with the London coffee houses of, well, I was going to say of former years, but I noticed he was recently opening a new coffee house around the corner. And the particular interest is how these ideas might help us tackle future global challenges. Today's lecture is called What Can Neuroscience Tell Us About Leadership? And is presented by Professor Jeff Bird. My name's Richard Harvey. I'm be convening this session, moderating the Q&A portion of today's lecture. If you're curious, I'm a professor of computer science at the University of East Anglia. I'm a former Gresham professor, hence the connection with the City of London. Right, a bit of housekeeping before we get started. I think we just popped up the agenda slide a moment ago, and it isn't very complicated. We're going to have this briefest of brief introductions from me. Then Jeff's going to do his thing for about 20 minutes. And then the rest of the time is spent with Q&A, which is always an attractive feature of this series. The speaker today is Jeff Bird, who hails from several places, but is currently at the University of Oxford, I think. Is that right, Jeff? Yeah.
Yes.
And he's got this very long CV and a list of very impressive publications. I mean, he looks very distinguished. The problem is, if I tell you how distinguished he is, we'll be here for a long time. And really, I suspect that both he's pretty busy and you're busy, and it would just be better if he sort of cracked on and told us his stuff. So the theory is I am just going to shut up at this moment and hand over to Jeff to tell us what he's going to tell us. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Looking forward to this. Let's hope the first hurdle of slide sharing works. I take it you can see this?
We can.
Wonderful. So, neuroscience leadership. Excuse me. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm a combination of a psychologist and a neuroscientist. I think about how the brain gives rise to the mind. And really what I'm trying to do here, and something I am continuously trying to do, is trying to take the science that we do away from paywall journals and language that is very, very hard to understand, and try and turn it into something that's actually understandable and something that people can actually use. So coming from University of Oxford and University College London, and I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor at TJC, Tobias Jones Consulting. What can neuroscience tell us about leadership? I reckon I could probably do about 3 months on this. So I've only got 20 minutes, and I will try to tell you a few things. I'm really keen for the Q&A. Feel free to go completely rogue. If there's something you want to know about neuroscience, about psychology, just ask. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you, but hopefully I will. I've been doing this for a few decades. Why might you be interested about neuroscience? I guess if you're a leader, if you're interested in becoming a leader, if you interact with people, you're interested in brains. Why? Because brains are the hardware that minds, people, run on. And unlike computers, we don't have other competing operating systems. Our brain seems to adopt a universal way of working across people. That doesn't mean there aren't individual differences. That doesn't mean there aren't cultural differences. But the basic way that brains work and the way that they give rise to minds is actually pretty simple. So what is this hardware? Well, it's this disgusting thing. Hopefully you're not eating lunch at the moment. The picture on the left is a view of the top of a brain that's freshly been scooped out of somebody's head. You can see there's a left side and a right side. Anybody that tells you that people are left-brained or right-brained, or that the two sides of the brain do fundamentally different things. They really don't know what they're talking about. There's 300 million connections between the two sides of the brain, and they work in concert. That kind of disgusting thing at the bottom, cerebellum, little brain, one part of your brain not protected by your skull. It's at the top of your neck. And the white thing at the bottom is your start of your spinal cord, if you've been desperate to know what that looks like. The multicolored picture is an MRI scan. I think that's me. It might be my brother. I can't remember. You can see the nose is on the left there, and the back of the head is on the right. And you can see the cerebellum. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but it's kind of in the bottom right-hand side of the brain there. So your brain's kind of amazing in terms of its complexity, first of all. So there's 100 billion neurons. Neurons are the basic building blocks of your brain. And 100 trillion connections or synapses in everyone's brain. There's a further trillion support cells, and that support is in inverted commas because we used to think these cells just enabled the rest of your brain to work, did the kind of housekeeping functions, but they probably also play a role in the things that we care about: higher order thought, decision making, emotions. The other thing that's particularly strange about human brains particularly is how expensive they are in terms of energy. They're very heavy, very expensive. Your brain is the one part of your body that can't store energy. You need a constant supply of sugar to make it work, other things as well, but it runs on glucose. So as it says there, it consumes 60% of your daily intake of glucose, of sugar, 30% of your calorie use, and those figures are appropriate for a Sunday morning when you're watching the Hollyoaks omnibus or something else and you're not really doing anything taxing. As soon as you start to make decisions, try and work things out, pay attention, use a lot of your memory, those figures increase, which is why when you're doing something that's quite cognitively taxing, you often crave sugary snacks or sugary drinks. We've got the stereotype of somebody spending hours doing computer programming, eating M&Ms. But obviously, the basic physiology, although of interest to me, isn't necessarily of interest to you. If we think about leadership, what we're really thinking about is humans and their minds. And this is a quote from Hippocrates, quite a long time ago now, which is still really true. If you want to understand people, their emotions, their decision-making, everything else, then it's a really good thing to know their brain. We talk about making gut decisions and decisions from the heart. Both the gut and the heart are very important. I want mine to carry on working, but it's your brain that does everything. So what can I tell you in 20 minutes? I'm going to give you a quick taster about how to optimize your performance and that of the team you lead. And really, if we think about optimizing performance, actually what we're talking about is learning. People talking about how to do more with less, finding new ways of doing things, creativity, innovation. Really, a lot of these things boil down to learning. How can we get better at doing something? And how can we encourage the people that we lead to also get better at doing something? And the good news is that as neuroscientists, we know huge amounts about this. And really, I think it's one of the real tragedies that we haven't successfully communicated these lessons to everybody else. People often talk about building better habits. What are habits in the brain? Well, we've got a cartoon here at the top of these neurons, and they're arranged in networks. Remember, the neurons are the basic building blocks of your brain. And what we see here in this cartoon at the bottom is a kind of a stylized representation of how neurons talk to each other. So a neuron will receive a signal. So if we look at the picture at the top, those weird tree-like parts on the left, they receive information, and it will send an electrical signal along its length. And when that electrical signal gets to the end of the neuron, it causes chemicals, neurotransmitters. You might have heard of some of these: dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline. Those chemicals are dumped into the gap between neurons, and the receiving neuron has little catchy things that catch these neurotransmitters, and that's the way that neurons talk to each other. They're using chemicals. They use electricity within the neuron, and they use chemicals to talk to each other. Why is this important? Well, what your brain can do, and what it does every single millisecond of every single day until you die, is change the strength of the connections between your neurons to optimize the way that you interact with the rest of the world. This is what learning is physiologically. It's making new connections, strengthening connections, weakening connections to make you better at succeeding in life. This process, this physical process, requires huge amounts of repetitions. Practice makes perfect. Yes, you need lots of practice. Figure of 10,000 hours, not really based on anything useful, but it's a useful metaphor. You need lots and lots of time. What does this mean for you? If you want people to change the way they work, change their habits, whether that's their views about themselves, your organization, the way they interact with people, you need to give them time and space to practice. There's no point doing a morning's training and then expecting everything to be fixed, or a morning's training and then 6 months later they're expected to put that training into practice. It doesn't really work. Give people time and space to practice. Ideally, let them teach other people. It's a great way to embed your knowledge, at least to summarize their learning. Feedback, absolutely important, both positive and negative feedback. If you want to shape people's behavior, give feedback immediately, certainly within 3 hours, and it should be positive and negative. The idea that you can wait for an annual performance review, even a 3-monthly performance review, to give all the feedback, and the idea that that will change someone's behavior is just a bit ridiculous. You want to give continuous feedback, and you want to be consistent in your messages and what you're rewarding and paying attention to. The thing that employees most hate is when their leader, their manager, is inconsistent. When they do something one day and they're rewarded for it, they do it another day and it's ignored or even punished. You really need to be consistent in your feedback, and that's the way to drive performance optimization. There's a whole other learning system, which is about goal-based learning. This is not about habits. So habits we can pick up unconsciously. We all know that. We can learn bad habits from people, for example. Goal-based learning is when you have a desire, a goal to learn something, whether that's learning French, learning to drive, improving your coding, whatever it is. Now, what's interesting is that by definition, goals involve attention. We want to work towards them. We want to learn information about them, and emotion. We get annoyed when our goals get further away. We get happy when they're closer. Now, what's interesting is that both attention and emotion are able to change the structure of these networks that our brain is made of. And whereas for habit-based learning, we need huge amounts of time and practice to change the way that the brain uses information, goal-based learning is incredibly quick. How do you lead for this? This is a kind of a coaching perspective. You inspire, you motivate, you share vision, you get people to buy in to your plans, you generate excitement. And there really is beautiful empirical scientific evidence. This is just one paper here that shows if you let people explore themselves and try new things, and you motivate them to approach the problem rather than giving them the solutions, then they learn much faster. The other thing that goal-based learning does is provide huge amounts of motivation. Learning is intrinsically rewarding, but this goal-based learning is massively rewarding, and it's really, really quick. So when you engage in goal-based learning, this was, I think, a trial of working memory training with older adults. You see this release of a chemical called dopamine, a part of the brain called the ventral striatum. And this is really important for both motivation and for driving learning. You see exactly the same patterns in the brain of dopamine being released in ventral striatum when people have close personal relationships, a kind of a coaching relationship. It's what happens when you take lots of cocaine. You have too much of this, too much dopamine in your ventral striatum, and you can burn out these neural circuits that give you joy, motivation, and your ability to learn. So these are really important systems. So goal-based learning is incredibly rewarding, motivating, incredibly fast, incredibly flexible, but you learn fast, you forget fast. It's transient, it's short-term. So what you really want to do is to encourage goal-based learning to get people to learn quickly, to find it motivating, rewarding, and then allow them to practice habit-based learning. Because once you've learned to ride a bike, once it's become a habit, you don't forget that. Classic example, learning to drive. initially goal-based learning, takes all of your consciousness. You can't have the radio on, you can't really talk to people. And after a while, when it becomes habit-based, it's just basically stamped into the structure of your brain. The other thing that is relatively new is our finding that the standard learning regions of the brain are completely separate from those regions that allow us to learn from other people. So much of our learning is social learning. We work with people all the time, and we just soak up not only the culture, but skills, how we interact with each other. And what's some really nice research from, this was Jennifer Cook's lab at the University of Birmingham, showed that actually there's a dissociation between people's ability to do the kind of standard trial and error learning and their ability to learn from other people. And what you find is that some people are very good at one, not so good at another, or they're good at both. The bottom line, though, is that actually we learn from other people all the time. And actually we preferentially learn from those in authority. So managers, leaders are really potent role models. People often tell me that it's incredibly hard to change culture. It's actually not. You just find influential people and you make them change their behavior, and other people will copy them. And so I think something that's worth thinking about as leaders is, what's your self-awareness like? Do you know how other people view you? Do you know the messages that you're implicitly sending to the people you work with about the way they should behave and about what's a good thing to do? So I could talk about learning for so long. Honestly, we know so much about it that's really just not incorporated in schools, in organizations, sports teams. We should be much better at communicating this stuff. The other thing is selection. Selecting the right people to be in your organization, in your team, selecting the right people to promote, to become leaders. And actually, we're awful at this. Why? Because we use weird things to select people. So one of the things we do is to use personality tests. There are really, really good, scientifically accurate, free personality tests that I've never seen an organization use. You tend to use ones which don't work, are completely invalid, and are really expensive. I find it crazy, but that is the case. They're also easily gamed, and it's not really sure what's desirable. I mean, you don't want people who are pretty horrible and not very conscientious. But to be honest, if you're giving someone a personality test and they say that they are not very nice and not very conscientious, you probably don't want them on the basis of IQ anyway. IQ is interesting. IQ is a great predictor of individual job performance. However, again, valid IQ tests are hardly ever used. Why? Because you need to be a clinical or an educational psychologist to be able to buy a valid one. And there aren't such good ones that are in the public domain. We use scenario-based questions. These tend to test people's imagination, their ability to say what's expected, to conform, to say what everybody else is saying. They often harm innovation. Interviews, well, if you haven't seen the evidence that interviews are not great, you really should have done by now. Humans are biased. Interviews are stressful situations. They're just not good. Social intelligence is the one thing that's so useful for leaders. Human beings, other human beings, are the hardest problems we have to solve. I just told you that minds are so complex. We need to work out how to motivate, inspire, teach humans. And social intelligence is so important. But to be honest, when do we assess this? And this is not really anybody's fault, because to be honest, up until about 18 months ago, I didn't know of a single valid test of social intelligence in either the academic scientific literature or the kind of organizational literature. We spent about 2 decades trying to develop our new test. And if anybody wants to help us trial this, please let me know. Social intelligence is so important. Why is it so important? Because there are some people in organizations that if you map out the social structure, they act as hubs. They're the people that get all the gossip first, that have the most influence, that can really sway your culture. Talking to the commissioner of the Met Police, they've had some well-publicized problems with some of their officers. And, they talk about having bad apples in the organization. If those bad apples are people that have huge amounts of social influence in your organization, you've got a really big problem. Ideally, you wouldn't have those people in the organization in the first place, which is why selecting for social intelligence, selecting for empathy, for compassion, for trustworthiness is such an important thing to do. So I talked about learning and selection. The last thing I want to talk about is decision making. Now, again, this is a topic that I could probably speak about for a week, but I'm absolutely determined to stick to my 20-minute limit, and I have 2 minutes left. How to improve decision making? Well, if we're thinking about personal, individual decision making, I think what we call gut instincts get quite a bad press. We've all seen Daniel Kahneman's work about cognitive biases and heuristics, and yes, there are some well-known examples where actually our decision-making process seems surprisingly fallible. But there are also some beautiful, beautiful work for neuroscience that shows actually sometimes huge problems, things that are much too complicated for us to represent consciously. Buying a house, for example. There are so many factors that determine whether that's a good house for you that you can't represent them consciously. And actually, sometimes our unconscious brains are better than our conscious brains at taking huge amounts of information and producing a rank order and giving us subtle signs that some options are good and some are not. When it comes to group decision making, we do this all wrong. We basically shouldn't be making decisions in big groups. Anybody that's brainstorming, terrible idea, poor quality ideas, less ideas, really bad way to do things. The two things that massively impact decision making are stress to a crazy degree, sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation changes the way we make decisions, changes our risk tolerance. The thing that's really terrified me, actually, and I read a lot of research on suicide and mental health and lots of things. Actually, the research on sleep deprivation absolutely terrified me in terms of its impact on our health and our performance. The other thing you need is this culture of experimentation. I always say that we need a 15% error rate. Lots of things converge on this idea that we need a 15% error rate. If you're not making any errors, then you are not attempting problems that are hard enough. You're coasting. You're not going to learn. You need to stretch yourself. And if you're making more errors than that, then you need to work on your processes. Obviously, you want to make it such that those errors are caught, that you're not producing output with those errors. But during the process of doing whatever you're doing, you want to be making about 15% errors. I haven't had time to tell you about all these other stuff. Feel free to ask me about them in questions, and that'll do for me. Thank you very much.
Oh, Jeff, that was so interesting. Yeah. I've got so many questions, as you might imagine. Let's use chairman's privilege to ask the first one, and then I'll shut up. Let's talk about energy. So you said that the brain uses all of this energy. Does certain types of learning or certain types of activity use more energy than others?
Very good question. Anything that produces physical change, so when you change the physical structure of the brain and the synapses, that requires a hell of a lot of energy. It's why it's tiring. Learning itself is very tiring. It's intrinsically rewarding, but tiring. And it's one of the reasons why your brain works out that you're burning through sugar faster, you're using more energy, which prompts you to have your sugary snacks or sugary drinks.
Should I learn in the morning or the afternoon? It doesn't matter. It matters when you've got some fuel in you, yeah?
And ability to pay attention. I mean, that's one of the big things. I mean, one of the things I'm asked to talk about with a lot of people is how to design shared working environments, shared offices. And they can be ridiculously harmful for learning because of the impact on attention. But yeah, when you think you've got a period of time where you can attend to something, that's the key.
Oh, that's it. That's interesting. Yeah, well, these questions could go on and on. Right, let's go to the proper audience. Right, Hugh Purser asks, on the subject of selection, how can we improve the selection of political leaders whom can have such a major influence on our lives?
Wow. I think the first thing is to decide what qualities you want those leaders to have, and then develop or use properly validated tools for those qualities. So if we decide we want empathic, compassionate leaders, there are ways to test for this. Communicators, do we want people that are conscientious? Do we want people that are moral, that make moral decisions? Again, there are scientifically validated ways to test for all these things. But actually, maybe the biggest thing is the process, enabling people who thought that they wouldn't be elected, they don't have the money or the time to run for election, maybe to allow more people to increase the pool of available candidates. Maybe that's what we need to do. That might be a personal opinion rather than scientific fact, that last one.
Well, we can come back to some of these, no doubt. So Catherine Curl asks, why do organisations promote subject matter experts to management positions, not good managers? Well,
this is a frustrating thing. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
I really don't know.
I'm a subject matter expert, so one wants to say, well, we're jolly good, that's why. But I guess what she means...
Yeah, I see this in law firms. People get promoted to partners and their job changes from being a good lawyer to making money, to networking, to finding clients, to selling. And something that makes you a fantastic software engineer doesn't necessarily make you a very good leader of software engineers. And the thing that really drives me crazy is not just the fact that people don't select for skills that make you a good manager, is that they think they can put someone through their leadership training program, which might be 3 hours over a year, and mystically they're perfect. What are those leadership training programs? Have they been properly evaluated? What skills are they meant to give? I think one of the things that frustrates me about doing this kind of work that I do is that neuroscience is often quite attractive to organizations. It may be waning now, but certainly a couple of years ago, it was the next big thing. And you had people that, had done like a half-day training course in neuroscience that were just giving all of these really bad suggestions, really not based on anything at all. And I would like organizations in general to rely much more on evidence when they're picking leadership training programs, selection tools, all this kind of stuff. But to answer the question, I don't know, and I wish they'd stop doing it.
Okay, so that segues into your observation, segues into a point by John Knight. It says, it seems to me that many of the facts about the relationship between neuroscience and leadership were discovered in the period 2000 to 2010, even though not much of it has not yet been incorporated into education. So great that you're promoting them. And then I think this is a but, which is, what are the most important discoveries from the last few years?
I think the importance of small groups when it comes to making decisions. So originally sort of between 2 and 4 people, for a number of reasons. So what we can show mathematically, and I always think this is really quite astonishing, and it doesn't sound astonishing, but when you think about it, it really is. It's been shown that if you get pairs of decision makers, providing they're within a fairly wide window of ability, so as long as they're roughly as good as each other, and that roughly is very roughly, you can find that pair of individuals outperforms the best person in that pair, which I think is actually quite profound. So 2 people working together can outperform the best person in that pair. You can see this effect works up to about groups of about 4. And we've often known for a long time about the kind of wisdom of the crowd phenomenon, where you get 1,500 people to pick stocks individually, and you amalgamate their decisions, and you find that the average is actually the best predictor of the future. What some really lovely work by Bahadur Barami showed was that, and his colleagues showed that actually you don't need many small groups of 4 people before, I think it's about 4 or 5 groups, so sort of 16, 20 people. The amalgamation of those groups' predictions will beat 1,000, 1,500 individual people. So the power of small groups, as long as they're reasonably matched for ability and they've got they're free to discuss what they want to discuss in the way that they want to discuss it, is actually really powerful.
So interesting. I work for the emergency services in my spare time, and these are very stressful decisions made under sleep deprivation. But they all have a very hierarchical command structure where it's difficult to bring in that. What they don't use the structure you're talking about. I mean, they can do, but it's hard hard to make it happen. That's personally, that's a very interesting observation to me. Now, Dan Fahini says groupthink was identified during the COVID crisis, and it's a hot topic. How can we overcome this tendency to avoid groupthink, which can make disasters so much worse?
Don't have big groups of people making decisions. We've known, in a hell of a long time before COVID, we've known for decades all of the myriad of ways that big groups make bad decisions. They tend to be more extreme. They're not creative at all. And actually, what tends to happen is that they are dominated by a few dominating individuals. They're not always the most senior person in the room, but sometimes they are. You can have the problem with big groups is that going against the grain is hard for humans. If 19 people are saying we should do X and you think you should do Y, there's a huge amount of social pressure to shut your mouth and go along with it. If you have somebody who is allocated wrong,
big groups might emerge when you feel you need lots of expertise in the room, like Cobra, where there's 50 people around the room, and some of those people are there just for show, I guess, but a lot of them are there because they know that particular thing about that thing.
Yeah, I think the problem is that people often don't organise groups like that. So, say you're in the COVID thing, there might be economists that contribute, virologists, epidemiologists, sociologists, whatever. If you've got small groups of those people to produce one output and put it together into a group that needs to make the decision, that's better.
Yeah.
That decision-making group should be small. Yeah.
So don't have a big flat decision. Have lots of little clusters feeding to your small decision cluster. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So Caroline Beardall asks, this is an interesting one, I think. Do different industries have leaders with different neurobehavioral attributes?
The honest answer is I don't know. Humans tend to reward confidence over competence. You see that all the time. Attractive people get easier rides than people who aren't attractive. Funny people get easier rides than people who aren't funny. Extroverts normally get easier rides than introverts. All of those combination of things tend to produce a similar type of person as a leader. It's debatable whether that's a good thing. I would imagine it's not, but I can't say that I've seen any hard evidence that is a bad thing. Obviously, rewarding confidence than competence is a bad thing, no doubt about that. Tomas Chamorro-Permazik has got some really interesting stuff on this. I can't remember the title of his book. It's something like "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" But it's
what's that book on military incompetence, which was a very early version of that, I think, talking about psychological disasters in the army, mostly in the army.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why interviews are bad. We tend to reward the person who comes across as most confident, not most competent.
Yeah, there's this famous paper, isn't there, called "Interviews: The Persistence of an Illusion." Why do we still think interviews tell us anything? Right, I must stop talking. Frederick Frank says, I understand brain volume has been decreasing in the modern era. I assume there's a glib quality versus quantity answer, but what do you think may have selected for larger brains for millions of years and then started selecting for smaller ones, if indeed that's true?
So elephants have got bigger brains than we have, but as far as we know, it's quite hard to measure IQ in other species, but as far as we know, they're not cleverer than us. Male brains on average are a lot bigger than female brains, but yet there is no difference at all on IQ. If anything, there's a very tiny advantage for females. It's hard to know what brain volume reflects at all, if anything, to be honest. To the extent that I do talks on diversity, so gender diversity, age diversity, and neurodiversity, and people often ask about brain volume and either overall brain volume or the size of particular parts or how well things are connected. I've never found any reason to be concerned about brain volume in any way, to be honest, at all.
Right. Yeah, like other organs. What was it Woody Allen said? It's my second favourite organ. Now, Mark Cook, so just a segue from you were talking about diversity. Mark Cook says, can Jeff expand on unconscious bias, i.e., corporate unconscious bias training, as it's got rather a bad name recently? We've had a few speakers talking about it, and what's come out, I think, is that people are very sympathetic to the objectives of the training, but the training itself has often been very painful for those involved.
Yeah, it's clear it doesn't work at all. It's based on really poor assumptions, really poor research, and the evidence is quite clear that it doesn't do anything whatsoever. I hate the way it's tested. There's arguments, even conceptually or theoretically, whether it could be a thing, unconscious bias, for attitudes. So yeah, I'm not at all in favour of that. I think the evidence is quite clear.
And Angela Squires made a neat point based on something you said earlier, which was, well, it's a question, but it's a point as well, I think. Should juries be 4 people rather than 12?
I would have thought so. I really think so. So the small groups is about accuracy. There may be times when you want something like representativeness, or you want a large group to have a shared sense of responsibility or something, where other factors might weigh into the optimal sizes of groups. But if you really want accuracy, then yes, I would say smaller groups are always better. As soon as you start to get 12 people, you get weird social effects. And in something like a trial, you want people to be accurate.
Yeah. I mean, there are numerous sort of dramatizations of trials where cultural architects basically drive opinion, don't they? A number of people are asking questions about the tests, and you said several things about tests. One was that there were some good free tests. Presumably you were referring to what's the one that everyone uses, which is rubbish?
MBTI.
Yeah.
Myers-Briggs. Yeah, completely invalid.
Myers-Briggs, yeah, which is notorious, isn't it?
Yeah.
But what are the free tests that people might have a go at?
So any test that tries to sort people into types of person is wrong. So that's not the way personality works. You don't get types of person. There are 5 dimensions of personality: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience, and neuroticism. So any one of the 3 tests that measure those 5 dimensions, use those. The question is what you do with that information. So we know that conscientiousness, and to a lesser degree agreeableness, but conscientious mostly, predicts success at work. Absolutely. But these are in the kind of studies where you might test a massive group of people in childhood or at 18, and then you track them across their life, and you show a nice correlation between conscientiousness and either how much they earn, educational attainment, or managers' ratings. All good, absolutely. Buy that research completely. You give somebody a personality test, which is asking about things like, do you tend to submit work on time? Do you try and do things to the best of your ability? That kind of stuff. If you give them to that in a job interview, and people don't work out what you're doing and try and lie, I would be surprised, to be honest. It's really the question of what you're using that information for.
Yeah, okay, I get it. So I've got an interesting question. Well, I think it's interesting from Canon. Well, Canon, I must apologize. I don't know if you're a Barrett or a Barrow, Barot. I feel you are probably a Barrow, but do criticise my pronunciation. Anyway, the question is, what explains differing levels of IQ if we all have the same brain functionality?
So much. Basic stuff, nutrition. Not so much within developed countries with good welfare systems, but across the human race, nutrition does a lot. There's always a big debate, and it's a ridiculous debate that makes no sense really and is a waste of time, about nature-nurture kind of effects. Yes, there are genetic effects. Yes, there are nurture effects. Education has a big effect on IQ. We like to think it doesn't and pretend it doesn't, but it does. Um, and the other way around, higher IQ people get more out of education. So it's very hard to separate these effects. So what tends to happen is you look at twin studies where you compare identical twins and non-identical twins, and they say that intelligence has got a huge genetic component. If you actually look at the genes themselves and try and look at people's genes and predict their IQ, like barely anything. So probably a huge amount of stuff, some of which is genetic, some of which is socio-cultural, the way that you've grown up, the kind of people, how many books you've got in your house, those kind of things when you're a kid.
Interesting. And well, I won't ask this because I want to ask other people's questions. So, Catherine Curl asks, how do you suggest that companies recruit if the standard tools are useless?
Some of them aren't. I mean, you can test IQ. IQ is really important. Like I said, we're trying to develop the social intelligence test. I think that's really important. I think that's what leaders really need. Empathy and compassion, you can test those two things. They're really interesting, actually. You do not want clinical professionals, emergency service workers to be empathic. You do not want them to take on the pain of the people that they're interacting with. You want them to be compassionate. Other times, empathy is a really useful thing for communication, negotiation, those kind of things. The crucial thing is to work out what traits you are selecting for and potentially what skills and experience, and then use valid tests of those things. So if you don't care if you're getting psychopaths, you just want pure raw cognitive ability, IQ, give them an IQ test. Pay somebody who's qualified to do so to give them a proper IQ test. If you want people with empathy and compassion, test those things. And I just don't understand why organizations buy these hugely expensive tests that we know don't work. When go and speak to your local academics.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? Right, time is really pressing on us, but a couple of people. So Catherine Beardall has asked, where does courage fit in? And Kathy Walsh has asked, how important do you think resilience is? So we've got a couple of sort of properties there that are highly desired by employers, but maybe don't fit neatly into some of the, well, maybe they do. So what do you think?
Yeah, really interesting questions. Resilience, obviously important. Ideally, we'd all live lives within organizations with jobs that don't require resilience. Obviously not going to happen. Resilience is very important. It's actually relatively okay to measure, actually. You can look at how people react to adverse life experiences. You can see good measures of individual differences in resilience. Quite hard to measure on the fly in an organizational context, but very important. Courage is an interesting one. So courage normally requires you to be afraid of something and to do that thing anyway.
So moral courage, I imagine she's talking
Yeah,
about.
exactly. And you absolutely hit the nail on the head there, Richard. There are different types of courage. And again, things like ethical decision making, moral decision making, or even just how you construe morality. Again, there's tests of those developed by psychologists and philosophers. How important are they? Kind of depends on the role that you're doing. How well policed it is, how well regulated it is, how much scope you have for engaging in behaviours that you might be afraid of. Two very important qualities, maybe best tested by experience.
Well, it's so interesting to hear you talk, Jeff. I mean, I was thinking while you were talking that, I mean, one of the problems of the city, of course, is that everybody's always after the same ideal person, with first class degree in maths and all of these things that are required. But the reality is that if you could be really precise in what qualities you needed, you could generate a fantastic recruitment strategy. It wouldn't cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah,
I guess. Anyway, Time is pressing upon us, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for all of your questions, and a special thanks to Jeff, a fantastic lecture. Just a couple of observations. This lecture and all our lectures are recorded. They're posted on the YouTube channel if you want to revisit anything. And the rest of the Knowledge Miles series are there. Second thing to say is, if you enjoyed this, then you might also enjoy the other free lectures that the City of London does. They're available from Gresham College, which also has a very impressive YouTube channel. Looking ahead, here are some of the things that are coming up. Look how broad-minded our audience are. They're interested in everything from Shackleton to the playing card industry. So good on them for enjoying all of that. Couple of thank yous. Thank you firstly to our speaker, Professor Jeff Bird, a very interesting guy. I really enjoyed that. Thank you to the audience. Fantastic set of questions, as always. Makes my life very easy. Thank you to Zien, who host all of this and put it all apart. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Thanks.
And thank you, Richard.